Okay, so now this is chapter 18, the prayer of union, and I'm going to stop after this one so that I can get them up on YouTube for you and then get to bed. So we've got quite a few chapters to go to chapter 2, but we'll work on that later. So, the prayer of union. May the Lord give me the right words to explain the fourth spiritual water. I need his help now more than ever. In the previous state of prayer, the soul dies to the things of this world. Yet she can tell that she is not dead altogether. She still has her senses, so she feels her profound aloneness. She makes use of external things to express what she feels, even if they are only symbolic. In every degree of prayer I have described so far, the soul gardener is working to move more. The soul gardener is working. In the more advanced stages, the soul receives so much comfort and delight that she would never want to abandon the cultivation of prayer. So she experiences her labor as glory rather than as toil. In this new state, the ordinary senses are transcended. The soul rejoices without understanding what she is rejoicing in. She recognizes that she is enjoying a good thing, one that encompasses all good things within it, but the goodness defies comprehension. The senses are so occupied with this joy that they are not free to experience anything else, either exterior or interior. In the earlier stages of prayer, the senses are allowed to give some indication of the tremendous joy they feel. But in the fourth water, the soul's joy is incomparably greater, yet she is much less capable of expressing it. Both the body and the soul are drained of the power to communicate. At a time like this, anything is perceived as a disturbance, a torment, and an obstacle to the soul's repose. The faculties are all drawn into union. Even if the soul wanted to, she would be unable to convey her delight. If she were able to describe it, she would not be in a state of union. I don't know how to explain this prayer they call union, or how it happens. Mystical theologians elucidate it, but I don't know the proper vocabulary. I don't understand what mind is or how it is different from soul or spirit. It all seems like the same thing to me. I do see that the soul sometimes shoots out of itself like a flame leaping from a blazing fire. But although the flame flies high above the fire, it is not something different from the fire. You, with all your learning, will understand how the fire and the flame are the same. I don't know how else to say it. I want to talk about how the soul feels when she is in this divine union. We already know what union means. Two separate things become one. Oh, my beloved, you are so good. May you be blessed forever. May all things praise you, my God. You have loved us so much that we are truly able to speak of communion between you and our souls here in our exile. This proves your boundless generosity and magnanimity, even in the case of souls who are already good. This abundance is who you are, my Lord. You give according to your nature. O infinite bounty, your works are magnificent. Even those of us who are not intellectually engaged with the things of the world find ourselves incapable of understanding divine truths. My intellect stops dead in its tracks when it ponders how you have bestowed such exalted blessings on souls who have offended you so much. I start to think about it, and I can't continue. Where could the intellect possibly go that would not be a backward motion? I cannot find the words to thank you for such precious favors, so I sometimes take comfort in uttering nonsense. In the midst of receiving these divine favors, the soul is powerless to speak. But right after God has blessed me in this way, or else just as he was beginning, I often used to say, Lord, look what you are doing. How quickly you seem to forget my wickedness. Obviously you have forgotten. How else could you have forgiven me? Well, I beg you now to remember it and to place such limits on your mercies. O my Creator, please don't pour such precious liquid into such a broken cup. You have already seen how I tend to spill it. Do not put a treasure like this in a place where the craving for worldly pleasures is not as deadened as it ought to be. Otherwise, you will only squander it. How could you entrust this fortified city and hand over its keys to such a cowardly defender? The minute the enemy attacks, she flings open the gates and lets him in. Do not let your love be so great, O eternal King, that you would jeopardize such priceless jewels. When you place your treasure in the power of such a lowly, wretched, weak, and unworthy creature, it gives her the excuse to undervalue it. She may well strive to keep it safe, with your grace, of course. In being what she is, she requires more help than most, but she is incapable of making use of the treasure to be of service to anyone else. Why not? She is a woman. She is not even a good woman, but a worthless one. It seems that whatever talent you have given her is wasted by being not only hidden, but actually buried deep in such a vile earth. You do not generally bestow such great blessings as these on someone incapable of benefiting many souls. I have begged you in the past, my God, and I will continue to beseech you with all my heart to grant these blessings to someone who will make better use of them than I, for the magnification of your glory. You already know that I would consider it a blessing to lose the greatest good that can be obtained on earth if it meant you would do this. It occurred to me to say things like this as well as other things to God. That was until I saw how foolish I was being. What a lack of humility. Okay, she's chastising herself quite badly in the verbiage here. And anyway, okay. The Lord knows perfectly well what is right for me. He knows that my soul would not have the strength to become liberated unless His Majesty instilled it in me through His divine blessings. So again, that makes me question her self-deprecation and how frequently Mirabai Star says she did it, and was that wholeheartedly believed, or was that for her the men reading her letters? I don't know. It occurred to me to say things like this as well as other things to God. That was until I saw how foolish I was being. Okay, I already read that, but I'll read it again. What a lack of humility. The Lord knows perfectly well what is right for me. He knows that my soul would not have the strength to become liberated unless His Majesty instilled it in me through His divine blessings. Well, then what are the effects that grace leaves in the soul? Can the soul do anything on her own to lift herself to such a high station? If so, what might that be? Let's take a look at this. Heavenly love elevates the spirit in union, but elevation and union are two different things. To those who may not have experienced this raising of the spirit, this may seem like a false distinction. Even though the two realities are ultimately one, the Lord works a little differently in each case. With the flight of the spirit, the soul experiences greater detachment from worldly things. In my experience, this lifting up of the spirit is a special mercy. I will admit that it looks almost exactly like union. A little fire is just as much fire as a big one, yet it takes a long time for a bit of iron to grow red hot in a small flame. In a big flame, the substance of even a large chunk of iron appears to be transformed quickly. This seems to me to be an example of how these two divine favors. Pardon me, I need to adjust myself here. Anyway, all right, that's better. This seems to me to be an example of how these two divine favors are different from one another. Anyone who has experienced raptures will understand this perfectly. To someone who has not had such an experience, I'm sure my explanation must sound like nonsense. It is a bit ridiculous for someone like me to try and explain something that cannot possibly be put into words. But I have to believe that the Lord is with me here. His Majesty knows that although I have been commanded to write this, and am compelled by my vows to obey, my primary motivation is to draw souls into the experience of sublime grace. I would not attempt to speak of things that I have not been through. In fact, this last spiritual water is so hard to explain that when I started to write about it, I was afraid it was going to come out sounding like Greek. So I put down my quill and went to communion. Blessed be the Lord who bestows His mercy on the ignorant. What great things come through this simple virtue of obedience. Just as He did with the previous spiritual waters, God Himself illuminated my intellect about this one, giving me just the words I need to explain this divine favor and showing me exactly how to use them. It seems that His Majesty is willing to say for me what I can neither say nor even understand myself. I am telling the whole truth here. So whatever is good is His own teaching. What is bad comes from that sea of wickedness that I call myself. There must be many souls who have attained the heights of prayer that the Lord in His mercy has granted to this miserable creature. If such souls are afraid They may have lost their way and want to consult me about it. They can rest secure in the knowledge that the Lord is helping his servant show them the true way. The fourth heavenly water is so abundant that when it falls, it saturates the whole garden. If the Beloved were to send this rain every time the ground became a little dry, the gardener wouldn't have much to do, would she? And if there were no such thing as winter and the weather were always mild, there would be no shortage of flowers and fruit, would there? Obviously, under such circumstances, the gardener would be thrilled. But as long as we are living on earth, this is impossible. When one water fails, we need to seek ways to obtain another. This water from heaven often comes when the gardener least expects it. Yet it is true that in the beginning stages of the spiritual path, the heavenly rain almost always falls after a long period of contemplative prayer. Between successive stages of prayer, the Lord lifts his small bird of the soul and places her in the divine nest to rest. He has watched her flying around for such a long time, striving with all her might to see God and serve him. She has strained her intellect and pushed her will. He wants to reward her for her hard work, even in this lifetime. And what a reward! A single moment of that grace is more than enough to pay the soul back for all the trials she could ever endure in this life. While the soul is seeking God in this way, she finds herself slipping into a kind of swoon. With a rush of gentle joy, she feels everything begin to fade away. The breath and bodily powers progressively dwindle. It takes tremendous effort just to wiggle the fingers. The eyes close of their own accord. Even if a person in this state were able to keep her eyes open, she wouldn't see a thing. She couldn't read or sound out words. She could barely recognize letters. If she wanted to read, the intellect would offer no help in turning the alphabet into comprehensible language. She can hear, but she does not understand what she's hearing. The senses do not serve the soul one iota in this state. In fact, there is the danger that they will do her harm by diminishing her sublime pleasure. It is useless for her to try to speak. Even if she could form a word, she lacks the energy to pronounce it. As the power of the body decreases, the strength of the soul increases, compounding the enjoyment of her glory. She experienced a vast and palpable delight. No matter how long it lasts, this prayer causes no harm. At least it has never caused me any. In fact, even if I had been ill before the Lord granted me this mercy, I always feel much better afterward. What harm could such a blessing possibly do? The external efforts are so obvious. Who could doubt that a great thing has happened to the soul? What else besides grace could rob us of our bodily strength, fill us with joy, and then revitalize our physical powers? It is true that in the beginning this state of prayer passes so quickly, it did in my case anyway, that the shutting down of the senses and other outward signs are almost imperceptible. But the soul has no trouble recognizing that the sun must have shone with dazzling intensity since it melted her away. It should be noted that even the longest period of time the soul remains in the suspended state is actually very short. If the faculties were suspended for half an hour, that would be a long time. I don't think it has ever lasted that long for me. Of course, since there is no sensory awareness in this state, it's hard to know what's going on. But I do know that very soon one faculty or another recovers and the prayer passes. The will remains captive in the divine web, while the other two faculties escape and revert to the mischievous ways. The quietude of the will draws them into suspension again and again, but they always come back to life very quickly. Some people end up spending many hours of prayer in this way. Once the faculties have tasted this wine and become intoxicated, they willingly lose themselves all over again just so they can drink some more. They join the company of the will, and all three celebrate together. Remember, this absorption of the faculties is over in a flash, but their return to ordinary functioning is not abrupt. In fact, they usually linger in a state of bemusement for several hours. Every now and then, God gathers them back into himself. We have come to the place where we need to try and say something about what the soul is feeling inside herself during this experience. Oh, if only I knew how to speak of this. We cannot understand it with our minds, let alone put it into language. I was reflecting on this after receiving communion and began being swept up into the very state of prayer I was writing about. How was I going to describe what the soul goes through at this time? Then the Lord spoke to me. The soul utterly dissolves, my daughter, so that it can fully unite with me. he said. It is no longer the soul that lives, but I. Since she cannot comprehend what she understands by not understanding. What happens in this state is so rarefied that there is no way to explain it any more clearly than this. Only those who have tasted it will know anything of its flavor. All I can say is that the soul sees herself as one with God. There is an abiding sense of certainty that accompanies this encounter. The soul is incapable of doubting the truth of her union with Him. The faculties are so radically suspended here that they completely fail to function. If a person in this state has been meditating on some scriptural passage, it will vanish from his memory as if he had never been thinking of it at all. If he has been reading, he cannot concentrate or remember a thing he has just read, nor can he recall the words to prescribed prayers. And so the wings of the restless little moth we call the memory are singed, and it cannot flutter around anymore. The will is entirely absorbed in loving, but it doesn't understand how it loves. If the intellect understands anything, it cannot understand how it understands. The mind cannot understand what the soul knows. I don't think the intellect does understand because, as I've already said, it can't be understood. I really can't understand this myself. There was something I was ignorant about in the beginning. I didn't know that God was in everything. Even though He felt so near, I thought this was impossible. But because His presence was so clear to me, I couldn't stop believing that He was there. Certain uneducated men told me that God was only present by grace. I didn't believe them. His presence was so tangible. I was confused. A very learned man from the order of the glorious Saint Dominic liberated me from this prison of doubt. He reassured me that God was with me and told me all about how God communicates Himself to the soul. This was deeply comforting to me. Just remember, this heavenly water, this magnificent gift from God, always leaves immense blessings in the soul. This is what I'd like to talk about next. And I'm going to stop reading because my voice is getting quite tired, 3 chapters here, and get these posted for you to be able to watch or listen to. I would recommend listening to and reading the book as we were doing before. And I love you. Big hugs and kisses to you and to Peter and Mariam and Pats to Silas, pardon me. I'm tired. Anyway, I love you, Mom, and I will reconnect later on to continue reading to get to finish part 2 before our book club meeting. I love you. Good night.